Got it.
Thank you. Good morning. Yes. Good morning, and thank you all for the slight scramble. Hopefully we didn't lose too many people on moving over to the new URL. We've learned something about Zoom, which is you can't put two groups of people in the same place at the same time, strangely. Okay, so welcome, good morning, good evening, good whatever time it is for you. Let me say thank you to Saad and Phillip for thinking of ways to try and help us get through triaging issues and debugging issues. So I'm going to kick this off to them. And then I'm going to, Phillip, if you can, I will request being a host from you and see if I can do that.
Okay.
Because that way I can help with the muting of people.
Great.
All right. Have at it, Phillip and Saad.
All right, Saad, do you want to give an introduction?
Yeah, so we're getting down to the last few weeks of the 1.5 release process. And during this process, we want to squash as many bugs as possible. We want to make sure that we ship a stable release. We have over 100 bugs in the 1.5 milestone. And we need the community's help in order to squash these bugs. But a lot of folks don't know where to begin if they have a bug assigned to them, or even if they don't have a bug assigned to them, which bug to pick up and how to get started debugging it. And talking to Phil and Sarah, we thought it would be a great idea to have a session where folks could somebody could walk people through how to start debugging, basically. And that's what Phil volunteered to do today. Phil?
Okay, great. Sorry, I just got pinged in Slack asking where we are. So I'm going to send that link into the Slack channel real quickly. eParis. So do you want to look at the Kubernetes dev and just make sure eParis is able to get in? Or maybe that just... Okay, great. All right, so I guess kind of the way I intended to do this was if anyone has... So instead of giving like an overview of how to debug stuff generally, which I think there's been a couple talks on already, and I think those have been recorded, so hopefully we can publish those or something. But instead of doing that, again, I want to just like help people who have issues assigned to them get started and start pointing people in the right direction and help you get over whatever issues you might get stuck on. And so I guess there's two kind of points you might be at. So one is that you have an issue assigned to you and you're not really sure how to get started debugging it. And the other is you don't have an issue assigned to you and you're not really sure which how to get a good issue to get started on. So I'll look at the chat here. So I guess, is there any way for us to get a kind of a feel for how many people have an issue already assigned to them and what help with that? Or is there like a hand raising thing or something?
There is. I have never tested it or used it, so we'll be out in a whole different world now. But yes, if you go to participants.
Okay, wow. So there's 95 participants.
Yep. It's quite the draw, Phillip, especially with all that scramble.
Yeah.
You can post in the chat.
It's just my celebrity, I guess. So it might not work to just go through everyone one by one. So we may have to change plans on here. Maybe instead it would be the first step we should do is ask people kind of like what kind of help they're looking for and what they're looking to get out of this.
I guess I, for one, would like to be able to point at least possibly signal the correct sig to look at a flake bug. Looking at the log message, at least to have some kind of idea.
So was that figure out which SIG should be responsible for a bug?
Yep.
Okay. Maybe the best thing to do then, like it looks like learn how to do debugging, process walkthrough, deep diving into a bug. So I don't actually have one lined up. Does anyone have one that they'd like help with, and we can just start walking through that bug and maybe start pulling it up?
I think you have a list, Saad, of flakes that no human has responded to.
Yeah, let's take a look at that list and see if we can pull one up for Phil.
So Saad's now going to demonstrate how to find the bug to work on. So Saad, do you want to share your screen and show kind of what you're doing so folks know how to grab a bug?
Yeah, sure. So basically, Phillip Miles has been helping me figure out. I think there's a lot of echo on this channel. Phillip Miles has been helping me figure out, keep track of what bugs are in the 1.5 milestone. He's been keeping track of this with a Google Doc that is referencing GitHub issues.
So I'm going to remind everyone, if you're not speaking, to please go ahead and mute your microphone, because we're getting a lot of background.
So here we have a bug that is, let me, assigned to the node team at the moment. Priority P1, it's a flake. It's a bug that was automatically created from our continuous integration system. We can look at the failure that caused the bug to be generated. And this was in the GCE. GCE is the Google Cloud environment. This was a serial test suite. The serial test suite runs all the tests, end-to-end tests in serial instead of in parallel. There are a bunch of tests that can't be run in parallel because of environment issues and various other things. So this suite basically runs them all in serial. And these are end-to-end tests. And so this particular test that fails is a density test. And I know nothing about this area, so this would be perfect to get started on. And so when this test first failed, the Kubernetes merge bot automatically created a bug for it, pointing back to the first occurrence. Each occurrence has the logs associated with that test run. So if you click on build log, you'll be able to see the end-to-end run for that particular test suite for that particular instance. And you can find this test inside.
How do we know what produced that log?
So this log was produced by Jenkins. Jenkins is what runs the actual end-to-end test. It's a Jenkins job. So if you look at this particular test in here, which I'm not sure why we can't find it. I might be looking for.
I think you need to get rid of the number of pods.
And sometimes the line is broken up. So like
Okay.
the first part of the test and the second part of the test, like it's actually on 2 lines.
That might well be the case.
Hey, Saad, would you mind posting the link to the
There you go.
in the chat?
Yep, that was it. Yeah, let me do that. So this is the issue that we're looking at. Now, if I could find the chat window again.
And then also so there was a doc. Is that the canonical way of finding an open issue to work on? Is that doc?
Yeah, let me share that doc as well.
And what should people do if they're starting to work on an issue? Should they update the doc or add a comment or something that says,
Add a comment to the issue itself. If you have the permissions to assign yourself. Otherwise, just post a comment saying, I'm going to start working on this bug.
okay, so look at the doc, and then the first thing you should do after clicking on an issue is check to make sure someone hasn't already said they're working on it, right?
Right.
So how do I navigate from what we've seen so far to the definition of the Jenkins job?
So we can show you that. What I typically don't go, the definition of the Jenkins job, are you talking about like what command is actually run?
So when I try to understand a log, the first thing I do is I need to know what produced the log. So I need to see, you know, the technical actual thing that produced the log.
I think that Jenkins configurations are stored in test infra repo on GitHub. I will put the link to them.
So yeah, let's see. I guess the actual command that is run, is that in the build log too?
The actual command that's run against the E2E cluster?
Yeah.
Yeah, that should be part of the build log. So if you look at the build log, let me see if I can share my screen again. All right, let's switch back to this tab. So for this particular test run, we were looking at the build log. So the tests are actually run in a Jenkins job. In this case, they're run serially. So there's a bunch of different tests that are run. So in this particular case, the create a sequence of pod tests. When Jenkins encounters this job, it starts executing a bunch of different commands, whatever is that particular test is, and we can look at the test in Kubernetes to see what exactly it does. So if we go into Kubernetes, and we search for this string, we should be able to find there it is, the exact test and what it does. So basically this code is executed against a remote cluster, remote GCE cluster. And basically it's going to be executing either one of two things, either kubectl commands on the command line against the cluster or directly against the API server, REST commands using the library, and then parsing the responses and expecting, for example, a pod to be created within a certain time, things like that.
So part of the reason I support this precise level of detail is sometimes the problem is not in the test, but in the setup of the test rig. Just create the thing to be tested. So that's why I'd like to know all the, how to find all the details so that I can debug all cases.
Okay, so that makes sense. And so to clarify, this first log that we looked at, the build log.txt is basically the Jenkins log. This is Jenkins saying, here's what I executed, and here's the result. And if we click into artifacts, this is a folder that contains files that were pulled down from the cluster that the test was executed against after the test is completed. So of course, build.log is the -log is there. This is the file that contains all the Jenkins logs. Artifacts contains different folders, including a folder for each of the nodes that make up the cluster. So in this case, we've got 3 different nodes, and if we click into any one of those nodes, we can see the logs from that particular node during that test. Usually what we're really interested in is the kubelet log. Kubelet is the binary that runs on the node, the Kubernetes binary. And if you're running tests against against a particular node, you are probably interested in figuring out what's going on with kubelet at that particular moment. And so this kubelet log will basically captures everything that happened on that node with kubelet.
Okay, thank you. Let me just back you up still even
Sure.
further, right? So again, sometimes what I work on is kube up, and
Right.
just running kube up fails. So again, I'd like to be able to go all the way back to the definition of the Jenkins job and see all the steps from the beginning. I've seen flakes, regarding just fetching the Kubernetes code, right? So things can fail just arbitrarily early. So in some cases, we need to see, all the steps.
Right. Let's see if we could pull up one of these bugs where there is basically a failure in kube up.
Just so we're
Because
clear, I thought that the output from KubeUp was also dumped into the build.log file.
yes, it is.
Right? So
That's
like
exactly it.
all the output from all of the commands, including cluster up and cluster setup and cluster down, should appear in that one log file right there, right?
So we've had a couple of points in the chat about let's stick with what we need to know to get started. I know, Mike, that you have some really deep use cases and awesome interest in debugging a lot of stuff, but if we go too deep in each of these, then we're not going to get any sort of broader overview on getting started.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Mike.
Can I clarify a little bit? Because I think this particular issue, because it's related to the node E2E, so it's different from the cluster E2E testing experience. So actually what you are saying, this Jenkins job, actually is run 5, like one node cluster. So each node run on the different OS image because we are cover like the 5 different OS image for current test validation, node validation test. So this particular problem have some performance or whatever things shouldn't be any release blocker because that latency, all those kind of things could be impacted by the API server at the CD and all those kind of things. And also could be like the CoreOS itself, like we have the experience CoreOS itself maybe have certain problem. And this is also another thing, this is Ubuntu Docker 9 cluster because we haven't dropped Docker 9 support completely. So this particular things is shouldn't be the 1.5 or any release blocker, but we monitor this is very close. So one things where I talked to with the test info, it is get rid of those, like the separate Jenkins job to test those kind of things, still have the test coverage, but unblock the submit queue and unblock the release. That's a separate issue. I just want to clarify here. And the first thing, when you look at debug, load E2E test, you should see the OS image first. So I think this Saad, when you click that one, you can see that the file, the first link, when you click in the issue, the first link, and actually the JUnit, we actually indicate which OS image it is. Yes, you just click anything. Yeah, you can see that there's the link, the JUnit, from the JUnit Ubuntu Docker 9. That's kind of indicate what kind of OS image the test is running. Yes. So
cool.
you first, yeah, I just want
Don, this is actually a great opportunity for you to show how you would debug a node E2E test.
Yes.
You want to step through this? So let's say somebody who has no idea, like me, how node tests are run. I encounter this particular issue.
Yes.
What do I do first? So I click on the...
I think you did really good. Just click this one, click on OS image, right? So which OS image?
Okay.
So you even can reproduce the problem. Because this particular problem is kind of performance related. You cannot really do much. But there's some specific node E2E functionality test. So you even can run the node E2E remotely on that same machine with the same image because the image is public, stored in the public image project. So you can start your instance and reproduce the problem. From there, this particular problem, because have a lot of other issues or maybe factors or those kind of things. But I just want to say that how you are going to normally test the node E2E failure and reproduce the problem. Later, I will post the link how to run a node E2E test against the remote node.
Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
Is this
Let's
a
find
good example to run with? Are a lot of the node ED tests the cases that we want folks debugging, or should we go for a different one?
Yeah, let's try a different one because I think the node E2E tests are actually relatively isolated. I'm going to see if I can pull up a better example.
So Don, for the node ED test, if someone has one assigned to them, should they just ping sig node? Is that the right step to take?
Don, is that the right step for node E2E tests?
Yes, you can ping the signal, and I normally regularly process all the problem related to the node. Yeah. So then we have find the people and yeah.
All right. So to help debug, to show a regular debug case, I think let's grab a test case that I am relatively familiar with. Unless, Phil, you've got another idea.
No, that works. Otherwise, we can. I'm going to look for one on the list.
Okay.
A good case while you do this.
Cool.
Hey, Saad.
Yes.
Phillip also dropped an issue that might be a good one into the chat.
Okay, let me take a look at that.
I don't think we expected 110 people here. We thought this might be more like professorial office hours where 4 or 5 people appeared and said, so I have a cool thing and I want to know how to do it. So forgive us as we figure out something that is broadly accessible for all of you. This is awesome to see this, and clearly there's a pent-up demand, so I think we're going to have to see a recurring event in debugging, in Adventures in Debugging.
Yeah, I show up to office hours and it's like, I'm supposed to give a lecture? What?
Yeah, it's different, and sorry. But getting questions from 110 people might actually be even worse.
No, this is awesome. It's great to see the engagement and enthusiasm for this.
Yeah, I agree. The last 2 times we did office hours, we had less than 10 people. It was very different, but also very interesting.
So maybe if you could just back up and give us a little bit of a big picture. That's the thing I'm missing most. I think Don was saying something that implies that I can use some public infrastructure to run tests.
Well, you can use, I think the default setup is for GCE or GCP. That's how the test scripts are configured to run. You might be able to run some tests locally.
I should be a little more explicit. I know there are tests that are run automatically as part of the regular pipeline. I'm not sure I understood Dawn correctly. It sounded to me like she was maybe suggesting I could explicitly trigger for my own purposes some other, or do somehow some other testing besides what's part of the normal automation.
Yes, you can run the EDE test yourself. And you can actually even, if you're trying to debug a flake, for instance, you can scope the EDE test to say, only run this test that I'm trying to debug. And you can also say, keep running that test over and over again until it fails. And so that's a pretty good way. One of the typical strategies for debugging EDE tests is looking at the logs, looking at the test failure, figuring out what you don't know, like I really wish I knew the state of X, Y, or Z, putting in additional debug messages to spam out the state of the system that is missing, and then running the test, just scope to that one test, like overnight, just say run it until it fails. If it's a pretty rare flake or something like that.
And this is in the context of a PR of mine?
Well, it could be in the context of a PR. Typically, that's not, so you could do that. That's not the workflow most people use. For the PR workflow, most people just assume the test is going to work and push it and let the automation infrastructure run the test for them because it's a little bit easier. The context that this is, most developers use this for is you have a flake that may be related to a test you wrote, maybe it isn't, but it's assigned to you, or you're trying to track it down, and it happens. Maybe it didn't happen on your PR, but it does happen 1 out of 20 times, and it now is happening way too much, right? And so now tracking down that 1 in 20 failures. And you know what happens.
Is this documented? So you're talking about asking for a particular test to be run on a particular branch or particular PR?
Not on a particular branch necessarily. It could be if it's on the release branch. Definitely not on a PR. Is not what I'm referring to. The workflow I'm talking about would be like, well, you could absolutely do that, but in that case, you would probably run all the ED tests, right? So what are you trying to?
In case it's not clear, I'm really lost here. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure out. You're telling me I can ask for a particular test to be repeated, but repeated on what?
Sorry.
How do I say that? And is this documented in the hunting flakes page? Am I just being redundant here?
I need to pull up the hunting flakes page to see exactly what's there. I'll take a step back and say the problem we're trying to solve is that a flake is occurring and we're seeing it not because no human is observing it, but the robot is observing that when other people are creating PRs, that this test seems to be failing or blocking the submit queue if we run it over and over again, right? And so there's many tests that would start failing as flakes. And you may be responsible for the change that caused the test to start flaking, or you may not. But your goal is to resolve why this test is failing that you may or may not have written or changed anything.
I just posted 2 links. One, it is how to run the E2E load test. And another link, it is actually backup what Phillip said, how to run the cluster E2E test, and how to repeatedly run the Jenkins test cases, because you try to reproduce the problem. In that document, you please take a look at that document. I actually have all the detail. I just screw that document.
Hey, Saad, Phil, can we go through something that I was doing last night? I can send you the first URL. Can you click on that, Saad, and share your screen? And then between the 3 of us, we can walk through that.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
let's do that.
Yeah, click on that link that I pasted on the chat.
If I could figure out a way to get back into the chat, let's see. There we go.
Okay, so we were looking at which failures we saw the largest. So we see that 57, right? So click on that one. Yeah. So we know that one failure is occurring 57 times, and then click on the test history at the bottom. Right, and then if you scroll to the right, you will see that once from the time this test was added, this has never passed, right? So you can fix the size to super compact. Yeah, so this test was recently added, and since the test was added, it has been failing. So then now, then what we did was we went to find when this test was added and what the test actually does. We can go through the build log too. So there is build log and there is artifacts, right? So if you go to artifacts, you can see the build log link as well. So you can see the build log link there. And then from here, the next step is to get the name of the test that failed, exactly like Saad showed you before. So you can subset like talk to API server, and then you can go look in either GitHub or in your editor and search for it. Yeah, talk to API server should work, Saad. Yeah. So let's look for that one in your editor or in GitHub search. Okay, yeah, click on that one, kubectl 565, yeah. And then switch on the blame, and then you can see that this is the specific one that was failing, 565, yeah.
So yours?
Not trying to, no, I didn't do this one, so I just know the fix. At least I think I know the fix. So, so it's a GKE, it's a test that runs only on GKE, and so it added a end-to-end test for a kubectl in a pod. And if you look at the, it adds a pod JSON file. So that's a pod JSON. It runs BusyBox. It mounts kubectl from a host path, right? And then it tries to execute the kubectl from within the pod. So can we look at the code? Yeah, scroll down. So essentially here, there is an exec kubectl version, right? That is probably the one that's failing. So let's go look at the build log. Yeah, if you see here, yeah, kubectl version is the one that's failing, right? So then the question was, okay, why is the kubectl version failing? And it's because it's not able to execute the kubectl executable, and it can't find it in the path. That was one clue. And then I went back to the pod JSON to see why, where is it picking from the host path? And it's hard-coded to user bin kubectl. And guess what? User bin kubectl is probably not available on in the Jenkins environment. So then the question was, what would be the replacement in the Jenkins environment? That was the next step. After that,
I just want to interject something here.
Yeah.
If this is running in a pod, we're not talking about the Jenkins environment, right? We're talking about the node.
This is a host path, so it is
the host path. It's picking up the host path, right?
Which is not running. So the GKE cluster this is being run on is not. It is not like locally executed on Jenkins. That's
right.
Some tests are locally executed on Jenkins, like a unit test.
I understand that. So essentially, we are injecting the kubectl from the host into the pod and then running it.
Right, and the host is a GKE machine.
Right. So and then I ended up with this after going through this. Okay, can you open up that commit?
Yeah.
So then the question was, how do I figure out what is the path, correct host path? And then going through the logs, I was able to figure out that there is a path that is being used for running kubectl. And if you scroll up, Saad, look at the commit message. Yeah. So on the GKE environment, the kubectl is in that specific path. Then the question was, how do I hard code that path, or do I find it at runtime? And then I figured out that there is a framework.testcontext.kubectl path that is there. So you first take the pod JSON file, do a string replacement, and then use that essentially as the host path at the bottom, line 23. Yeah. So this was my outcome of trying to fix a test that was broken.
Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome. That's great. It looks like we got all the way to a resolution there, right?
Well, I still have a problem, which is I can't run this on unless it's already merged because some of the tests that pick up this specific test does not kick in until the thing is merged.
So I had a quick question about your interactions with KTebot on here. I see you're asking it to CVM. Kate, could you scroll down just a little bit? Sorry. There's something about GCI, GKE, E2E test this, and CVM, GKE, E2E test this. Is that syntax documented someplace?
Right now, those two lines, I picked it up from test infra. I can show you where I picked it up from, but yes, that would be good to document.
Okay, but it also looks like the bot tells you
Right.
in the comments how to rerun tests.
That's right, and bot doesn't, like I said, some of these tests are not run by bots, so it's very difficult to figure out how to run these. And this specific end-to-end test is, doesn't show up in any of the PRs. So you can't, there is no hook for it. Give me 1 sec. Let me find you the.
So basically, not all end-to-end tests are run on every single PR. Only some subset of tests are run. If the subset of tests that run fail, you will get a message from the bot saying that it failed and how to rerun that test suite. In this particular case, the test that DIMS fixed wasn't part of the test suite that gets run against every PR. So in order to verify that you fixed it, you have to run it locally. When you run it locally, what that means is you need to have your own cluster that you can run it and test it against. If you have a GCE cluster or GKE cluster that you can test against, that would replicate the environment most closely. In this particular case, the issue is against GKE, so.
That makes sense. And just to clarify, the reason not all tests are run, just so we all understand, right, is tests that are run against PRs must be fast and they must be capable of being run in parallel for maximum and quickest feedback. There are some E2E tests that are very slow and take an extremely long time, on the order of hours, to finish. That's why they're not all run against the PRs.
That's right. So I pasted a link to how I figured out the magic commands. So can you click on that one, Saad? Yeah, so this is, I picked up one of the bot messages and then I went to test infra and I plugged that in and you can do a discovery that way. But yes, we should probably document these. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm from SIG testing and I know how to find these, but thank you for describing how to use search. Somebody from Google using search to solve a problem sounds kind of amazing to me.
Dims, this is super deluxe awesome. Thank you for pulling in the issue that you had A, been looking at and had nearly resolved, and B, brought as a great example.
Thanks, Sarah. Back to you, Phil and Saad.
One thing, a couple things, that was great. A couple things you can also do are you can, in that case, you can spin up a GKE cluster and you can actually create that pod and then try to attach to it and then look around and see what's going on, or create a pod similar to that that runs like Bash or something and connect to it. And then go ahead and verify that the executable isn't where you think it is, and then verify that it is where you want it to be, and then run the version and make sure it works.
Right. So what I did was I did a local cluster up. I deployed the pod JSON, and it ran the busy box. I did an exec in and looked around, and it looked fine. Then I figured out, okay, looks like the path is missing, and that's how I ended up doing that. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I can run through another test that I debugged recently, if that would help.
So I'm going to interrupt for 1 second and say, is this, do a meta question. Is this useful? Do we want to do this again? What would make it better? So let's have people put that in the chat while we go ahead with whatever the next one is.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great idea. So this particular test was testing GCE persistent disks. So again, this is an issue that was filed automatically by the Kubernetes bot because continuous integration test was flaking or failing. This is the report generated when the test failed. It's linked to from the issue. And looking at it, it's a test. Pod disk should schedule a pod with a read-write persistent disk, ungracefully remove it, then schedule it on another host. Anybody that doesn't work in storage probably has no idea what that means. So the first thing would be to, let's take a look at the test grid. So if you click on recent runs, what it does is it shows you the recent runs for this particular test suite. And you can see how often this test suite has failed. And if you click on test grid history for job, you can actually see all the tests that are run. And what we're interested in is this particular test. If you click on options, you can filter by regular expression, basically the name of the test. So what I want to do is just filter down to that particular test. And let's shrink the size so we can get a better feel for it. So we can see that every now and then this test does flake, and the error is identical. So the next step is trying to figure out, why is this error happening? What's going on here? And let's figure out where this test code actually is and try to understand what it's doing. So we're going to go to Kubernetes and we're going to look for the code for this. We can see that the code for this particular test is under test e2epd.go. Let's take a look at that particular test. This particular test is only executed if you're running against GCE, GKE, or AWS. And if we look back at this particular test failure, we can see that it was in GKE, as well as, well, this one was only on GKE. And we can take a look at what this test does. It creates a persistent disk. Then it creates a pod referencing that particular disk. Creates two pods on two different nodes. There's some methods to do cleanup after the test completes. And so this particular test, when it creates the pod that references the disk that was created, it creates it against a very specific node instead of letting the scheduler pick a node at arbitrary. Then once the pod is created, it basically writes content into that particular, onto the disk through that pod, and then it reads it back, verifying that the content is available. So it actually removes the pod from the first host, puts the pod on a second host, and then reads the content back and ensures that the content is identical. So basically what this test is trying to verify is that when a particular pod that is using a GCE persistent disk is scheduled to one node, deleted from that node, and then moved to a different node, when it comes back up, the data that was written from the first host should be visible on the second host because they're using the same persistent disk. If it's failing, that indicates data corruption. So that's actually pretty bad. And in this particular case, this test that's failing, let's take a look at the build log. The build log is from Jenkins. So the test starts, it creates a persistent disk, it submits the pod to host 0, it writes a file into the container, so it wrote this particular value, then it deletes the pod from host 0, then it moves the pod to host 1, and it tries to read the value. And when it reads the value, that's when things go wrong. So we expected the value 217 blah, 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 but what was read back was empty string. So that means that something went wrong along this path and we need to figure out what happened. After this is just the cleanup steps, the defer that you saw in the code. This is just tear down steps that get executed. And once the tear down steps are completed, then the test fails out. It says that the expected didn't match. So now we need to figure out what happened here. And so in order to do this, what I did was I ran this test locally against my own GCE end-to-end, my own cluster, just back to back to back to back until it failed. And I went in and I added in more logging to try to isolate where exactly the failure was happening. I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, but basically what we found was that the data actually still existed on the disk, but what was happening was the kubectl command that was being used to read the data from the pod, basically execute a command against the pod. Let's say, a command that cats out the contents of a file. That kubectl command for exec was actually returning empty string, even though the data was still there. And let me see if I could find that particular bug. So basically, what was happening was the kubectl exec that was being used by the test case was returning the wrong data. So the good news here was that this wasn't data corruption. The bad news is that there was a bug somewhere in the path between kubectl exec and the container itself. So I opened a bug. I wasn't sure where to go from here, but this was a good place to start. Then folks started jumping on this particular bug, and they realized that there was an issue with Docker. That Docker exec, which is what kubectl exec calls underneath, actually had a bug, and there was an issue opened against Docker. And NCDC actually was able to isolate this issue even more. So remove all the gunk from the Kubernetes end-to-end test and just do Docker exec back to back to back. And he basically had a repro where Docker exec would sometimes return empty string when it shouldn't. So right now, I believe this has been fixed in Docker, in a Docker version. In the meantime, what we ended up doing in Kubernetes is adding retry logic around this particular code so that if we see unexpected responses from kubectl exec, we're going to retry a few times to ensure that that is, in fact, a real failure and not a fake failure. So we worked around the issue until we're able to pick up a new version of Docker.
I actually remember this issue. And a couple of things I think we looked at is originally thought it might be part of kube control. And so one technique I think that we might have tried was trying to eliminate where or identify what area the bug was in, right? So like kube control talks to the API server, which talks to the node, right? And so, trying to reproduce. So if we can reproduce on kube control, then can you reproduce just using the API directly without kube control and eliminate, okay, this isn't a kube control bug. Okay, then can you reproduce just running this on the node, right? And then eventually we got it down, okay, can we just reproduce this just using Docker, right? And then once we were able to isolate it there, the problem was scoped much better. And the other thing, I'm not sure if we tried this here, but as a general strategy for trying to debug flakes, if you see them failing sometimes but not other times, one strategy I suggest is retry the logic inside the test to determine, is this a flake that fails sometimes but will always fail on the node, right? Because the node got set up badly, or the state of the system is set up in a way that we're always going to see this flake for this particular cluster setup, right? or is it a true race condition where on a given cluster, if we run the same thing 3 times, it might pass and it might fail, right? And that will allow you to start, if it's part of the cluster, you can start looking at the state of the cluster and how everything's set up, and potentially even leave the cluster in its current state, and then, or leave a running cluster up and then trying to look at, reproduce it on the running cluster.
So Phillip, we're out of time, which is not a good problem to have. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us. What I am seeing is we have sort of 2 different types of questions, and correct me if I'm wrong, or send me emails because you all do. Saying we need more information about the testing suite and how to debug tests, but then there's also interest in debugging the Kubernetes code. So once you find out that there is a test problem, you can find out where the test problem is, and then you get to what's actually happening, and then there's a whole separate chunk of debugging that is involving the interior of the Kubernetes code. So it sounds like both of those are of interest, and I heard a couple of really good suggestions around basically pair debugging instead of doing this as just come and ask questions or prepared lecture, but have somebody scheduled to bring or a couple of people scheduled to bring something they want to debug with one of the team who's more senior. So we will schedule another of these again. We did this around 1.3. We missed 1.4. We can talk, and we can also talk on the Slack channel, as everyone says. So we will do this again, and I will try and schedule these more regularly. But that also means that we need people to show up with things they want help debugging. So if you can send me those and send me times that you're interested in it, we will see what we can do about scheduling more. Thank you all, and another time.